Check. Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel and welcome to this specific video. In case you didn't know, the first video on this channel was a discography dissection of one of my personal favorite bands, Ween, and I'm going to do another one of those for you guys. This time I'm doing another band that I personally love, in case you can tell by the title of the video and the thumbnail and the records and the shirt I have on. It's Nirvana. Sorry Rivers, we're still not talking about Weezer. Well, I mean, everyone already knows about Weezer. That's a fair point, but I already planned everything out. I already started recording. I already have everything set up. We're doing this video, okay? I promise I'll eventually talk about Weezer. Anyways, now Nirvana was not the first band I ever fell in love with, but they were definitely one of the first bands. I can still remember when I was maybe 14 and I was on a car ride down to Myrtle Beach because that's where my family and I were going on vacation, and it was a long car ride, so I figured I would put on Nevermind because I had heard a lot about that album and I just felt curious about it, so I put it on. And needless to say, that listening experience stuck with me forever because, I still remember it, and I have listened to over 1,000 albums at this point. Nirvana is also just a huge band for a lot of other people, and I figured, this will be one that a lot of people would enjoy. So let's get into how the band originally started. As many people know, Nirvana is very much a big example of what is called the Seattle sound. This obviously refers to bands that come out of Seattle, Washington. This applies to many other bands, primarily bands in the grunge movement like Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, Alice in Chains. You get the gist. Now, obviously, the band started off with Kurt Cobain. Kurt Cobain wanted to start a band with his longtime friend, Chris Novoselic, but initially, Chris was not up for the idea. Eventually, Kurt handed him some demo tapes from the band that he was in at the time, called Fecal Matter, which actually managed to get Chris sold on the idea. And while Dave Grohl is known as the main drummer for Nirvana, he did not start off as their drummer. They would actually cycle through a decent amount of drummers before they would settle on one for their debut album. First, they had Aaron Burkhardt for a while, then Dale Crover, and then they had Dave Foster, who just kind of lived too far away, and there just wasn't a lot of chemistry in between them. He even ended up seeing Nirvana perform without him on drums. So this obviously led to Kurt firing him with a letter where he would let him know that they had found another drummer and also apologizing for the short notice. But the drummer that they would land on would be Chad Channing, who would stick with them for their first album and a little bit of the touring after. And obviously this leads us to the debut album by Nirvana, Bleach, would be released on June 18th, 1989. You would hear a lot of the core traits that you would hear on their other albums on this album, but there is still a lot of other influences put into this. In my opinion, this is easily the heaviest Nirvana album, with parts of it even arguably being sludge metal, but a lot of the things that you would hear on here would actually be kind of noise rocky. You could easily make out a lot of their influences though, such as Butthole Surfers, particularly on songs like Negative Creep in my opinion, and also Melvins, with just the general aesthetic that they would have on the entire album. Before the album would be released, they would have the single Love Buzz, which would be a cover of the song obviously by the same name, by the band Shocking Blue, and after Nirvana would blow up, this cover would kind of eventually overshadow the original song. And then they would also release another single, Blue. Now you may notice on the album cover, which you can see right here, there is a second guitarist pictured in the cover art, despite the fact that Kurt is really the only guitarist known for Nirvana. And that second guitarist would actually be Jason Everman, who played in the alternative band Mindfunk, and did bass in Soundgarden as well. And despite being pictured and credited, he would actually not play on the album. The album would be produced by Jack Endino from Mudhoney and Soundgarden as well, and before Nevermind came out, which led to the band obviously blowing up, it would sell 40,000 copies. Now, despite this being Nirvana in their infancy and them kind of still finding their sound, I actually really like this album. I think it's really solid. There's some really heavy parts, especially with songs like Paper Cuts and Negative Creep and School, that honestly are heavier than some of the metal I listen to. There's also a lot of riffing on here, particularly with songs like Floyd the Barber and the actually pretty technical Mr. Mustache. Overall, this album just sees Nirvana displaying a lot of their punk influences, their rock influences, and even their metal influences, because Kurt would credit Black Sabbath as an influence. Overall, this album's great in my opinion, and even though Nevermind and In Utero overshadow it in terms of how popular they are, it's still definitely a really good record. And it's also much different from those other albums, so why not check it out? But this album would actually end up with an 80% from me.
I do, but you have a clue.
Next up is obviously the extremely famous album, Nevermind. Now, before this album was released, they didn't really expect it to be that much of a commercial success. They most likely estimated it to sell probably a little more than Bleach did, but it wound up actually blowing up the band. And as of recording this, it has sold over 30 million copies worldwide, which is pretty insane. Now, before actually recording and releasing the album, they would do some early sessions, still with Chad Channing, where they would record a lot of their early ideas and a lot of the songs that would wind up being on Nevermind. Some of the songs didn't make it on there, but they would still end up being released later on, such as Dive, Sappy, and a cover of Here She Comes Now by the Velvet Underground. Now, after these early sessions, the band would go and do a little bit of touring, which Chad Channing would leave shortly after, which made them obviously need a new drummer. Now, I believe Kurt Cobain was at a punk show where he saw the band Scream playing live, which had Dave Grohl on drums, where they were just immediately impressed by his performance, so they contacted him. Scream would break up, which led to Dave immediately going to the band and saying, "Hey, I want in." So now we obviously have the famous trio that Nirvana would become to be. Now that they had the full band that they needed, they planned on working on the album. Now initially they planned on releasing it under Sub Pop, the label that they were signed to for Bleach, but Kurt decided to just say fuck it and sign to a major label, which he wound up actually getting the band signed to DGC, which might be thanks to Kim Gordon from Sonic Youth, thanks to her giving a recommendation. Now the band decided to work with Butch Vig, who was also in the alternative rock band Garbage. So they took their early sessions that they had done with Chad Channing, and then they did the rest, made songs like Smells Like Teen Spirit, and then filled in the rest of the holes, and then we got our album. Obviously, like I've already said, this blew the band up. The album will become a huge commercial success, with it selling 300,000 copies a week. After its release, the music videos for In Bloom and especially Smells Like Teen Spirit were just making endless waves on MTV. This album is also noted for kind of killing off hair metal, since hair metal was already kind of starting to struggle, and then this just blew up and became insanely huge. And to be honest, I don't think I could come up with the words to describe how genuinely huge the album became. It would get them 3 Grammy nominations. Kurt Cobain was immediately labeled as the voice of a generation, and then in 2004 it was even added by the Library of Congress to the National Recordings Registry. Now, in case you are wondering what's in the National Recordings Registry, it's only things that have a large amount of cultural significance. For instance, I believe things like MLK's I Have a Dream speech is in there, so this is pretty big. Now, before releasing, DGC would have them put out singles like Smells Like Teen Spirit, Come As You Are, Lithium, and In Bloom, which obviously hyped up the album quite a bit. And obviously, like I said, I love this album. You know, I feel like even if I were to somehow grow out of the music that is on the album, there would still be a ton of nostalgia that I would experience when listening to it, but I never see me growing out of this music, so that'll probably never happen. But this album has been an example for a ton of people of a perfect album, and I see it, honestly, I genuinely do. I just genuinely love the entire track listing just because it is diverse. They managed to successfully convey such a large array of emotions with the music that they put out on here. And even though a lot of people consider Kurt's lyricism to be nonsensical, especially on things like Smells Like Teen Spirit, there are a lot of really great lyrics on here. There's some great, very vulnerable and emotional ones, as well as some pretty disturbing ones, especially the song Polly. By the way, the cymbal hits are actually Chad Channing, not Dave. They didn't credit him though. And a lot of Kurt's very visceral lyrics can be credited to his broken relationship with Toby Vale of Bikini Kill, which just adds a whole extra layer of not only cool music history to the album, but an emotional layer as well. Now, I could just honestly list the entire track listing for songs I like, because I like every single song, even the secret song Endless Nameless. I find the very abrasive, chaotic sound of that jam session to just be really effective and fits very well with Nirvana's style. This album also is very important to me because this was some of the first music I ever learned on drums, and I still love to go back and play this entire album on my drum set. Just started at Smells Like Teen Spirit and ended on Something in the Way. Overall, if you just like alternative rock and punk and you somehow have not heard this album, you'll probably like it. It has a ton of very punky moments, especially the very fast Stay Away and the very moody Territorial Pissings. But then there are obviously a ton of slower songs like Polly, Lithium, and Something in the Way. And between those, there's just a ton of rock bangers. Smells Like Teen Spirit, In Bloom, Come As You Are, Drain You, and one of my personal favorites, Lounge Act. I find that song to be infectiously groovy. But, yeah, this album to me is very close to perfect, and that's why I gave it a 98%.
Hey, wait, I've got a new complaint.
And we are already to the final album, In Utero. Now, after Nevermind, the band would obviously be huge, and with that, DGC, their record label, is gonna want them to ride that success. So the band kind of immediately wanted to get working on another album, but they all kind of lived in different areas, and also Kurt Cobain and Courtney Love were expecting their first child, so with them not really able to put out an album, the record label just put out Incesticide, which I'm not going to really go into or review just because it's not a proper studio album, but I will say I absolutely love that album. It's great. There's really not a bad B-side on it, to be honest. I really love all. But once they were able to get working on their next album, Kurt Cobain wanted to hire Steve Albini, most notably from Big Black, as their producer, just because he absolutely loved Surfer Rosa by the Pixies and Pod by the Breeders. Both albums were produced by Steve Albini. Initially, Steve Albini turned it down, calling Nirvana REM with a fuzzbox and an unremarkable version of the Seattle sound. Needless to say, he was not a very big fan of their music, but he's a legend, so I'll back off. I also do really like Big Black, so I'll back off. But he would eventually accept the job because he felt sorry for them, calling them, and I quote, the same sort of people as all the small fry brands I deal with. As soon as they got into working on the album, Albini would put a small policy stating that he would only work with members of the band. Because according to him, everyone who associated with Nirvana was, and I quote, the biggest pieces of shit he had ever met. And one really cool thing about this album is the band didn't really discard takes, and they pretty much used everything that they had recorded. And Kurt Cobain, despite the fact that he was dealing with heroin addiction, he was very much sober and focused in the studio, according to Steve Albini. And apparently there would be one other disruption in the middle of the week when Courtney Love would show up because she said she missed Cobain. And apparently this would cause tension because she apparently just criticized the music and was confrontational with everyone present. And what I know from Courtney Love, I don't know, kind of sounds like it adds up. And during one of the days when they were not getting the desired mix that they wanted, they actually took a break, and with Steve Albini, they would just watch nature videos, set things on fire, and make prank calls. sounds like a good time. Now, after the recording session, the band and Albini would actually be really happy with what they had. Unfortunately, when they gave it to the record label, they weren't that happy. They genuinely called it unlistenable, and they wanted it to redo everything. This kind of threw a wrench in everything, but Kurt Cobain just eventually decided, no, and then they just kind of released it as is. Now, before it would be properly released, they would have the singles, Heart-Shaped Box, All Apologies, Rape Me, and Penny Royalty. Now, this album would actually be pretty different from everything before it. It would be very abrasive while also being very soft in different sections. It was actually pretty experimental and arguably noise rock. But honestly, with everything that they tried on the album, everything worked out, if you ask me. From the extremely abrasive songs like Scentless Apprentice, Milk It, Radio Friendly Unit Shifter, and Tourette's, to the very softer songs like Heart-Shaped Box, Dumb, and All Apologies, it all works out and it all feels like it's flowing really well despite it being such a large variety of styles. Not to mention Steve Albini's amazing production. There's such a real sound to this album, and it's mostly thanks to the production. Honestly, every single song on here, and even the deluxe songs like Gallons of Rubbing Alcohol Flowing Through the Strip, and the song written by Dave Grohl, Marigold. I love everything associated with this album. I genuinely consider this album pretty much the same quality as Nevermind, potentially even better. Depends on the day, I guess, which is exactly why I gave it a 98%.
Never in debt to your priceless device. Hey.
Now, after the release of In Utero, the band would obviously do some touring to promote it, but unfortunately 6 months after its release, Kurt Cobain would take his own life. This was obviously a huge shock to everyone. They were big for 3 years, and this obviously caused Nirvana to disband. Since their disbandment, though, there still has been a lot of things going on with the band. For instance, tons of deluxe versions of the albums, anniversary versions of the albums, and live recordings have been released since the band's disbandment, as well as a self-titled compilation which had the last song that they would ever record, which would be You Know You're Right. The band would also end up being inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame the very first year that they were eligible to. They would also be awarded with the Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award, which is a lot more special than just any other Grammy. And since the band's disbandment, Dave Grohl has obviously gone on to form Foo Fighters, as well as do a bunch of other things like Them Crooked Vultures and Queens of the Stone Age, and Chris Novoselic would kind of retire from music mostly and then go on to do politics, but he would dabble in music every once in a while. And Kurt Cobain's widow, Courtney Love, obviously has continued a lot of Kurt Cobain's legacy, especially with her own band Hole, and even their daughter, Frances Bean Cobain, would go on to honor her dad in a lot of great ways.
As you are, as you were.
So those are my opinions on the legendary band Nirvana. Let me know what you guys think, if you guys agree, disagree, maybe you guys hate Nirvana, I don't know. But yeah, go ahead, like, subscribe, do all that stuff, comment, favorite. Thank you guys for watching. Fucking pants. My pants. And while Dave Grohl is known as the main drummer for